want to say a couple of things before launching this lecture. One is to say that this is my ultimate service to Gilder, Lehrman, and to the other scholars and historians who are going to speak here, because you can imagine how many people volunteer to speak immediately after David McCullough. 0. So here in the wake of the Queen Mary, as they sometimes say, I am paddling my little rowboat, and I'm sure you'll be kind, exercise that empathy, and take it all into account. I want to say another quick thing or two. John Adams and Hamilton came up, and thank you for that. And I've seen Hamilton more than 50 times because, as many of you know, Gilder Lehrman does the Hamilton Education Program, thanks to the Rockefeller Foundation and the Miranda family and the producers of Hamilton. And we are now in the third year of a 5-year program that's bringing the Hamilton education experience to 250,000 Title I students across the country. I think we've now been in almost 30 cities, but the standing productions in New York and Chicago are ongoing. And one of the things, in touching on Adams, and of course there are a couple of touchy moments in the show referring to Adams, but one is Hamilton being rebuked a little bit about how John Adams spends the summer with his family, and Hamilton gets into a lot of trouble the summer that he doesn't spend with his family. If you've seen the show, you know what I'm talking about. But for us at Gilder Lehrman, we created the education program. The students all not only do a curriculum in the classroom with their teachers, but then they go and do research on a curated website that we've created for that program. And it has 42 historic figures and 14 events and a cluster of primary source documents. And the kids are all assigned to go into that website, choose a topic they're interested in, any person or event, and pursue it. And then instead of writing an essay or research paper, they're supposed to write a poem, a song, a rap piece, whatever. And they do what Lin Miranda has effectively done. And every kid who comes to see the show has to submit that original piece of work before they come. So when they sit in the audience, and these are kids many times who've never been in a theater, but they've done this work to prepare, they have an engagement that is unbelievable. But many times I have had the pleasure of seeing students on stage performing acts that they've created that are based on characters who are not in the show. And Abigail Adams is one whom time after time high school students, especially females, pick out. And I have seen Hispanic girls in Los Angeles, from two different schools, get on the same day and do acts that were inspired by reading Abigail Adams' works and writings on our website. And of course, she's not mentioned in the show at all. So one of the joys for us is that students are not only inspired by the show, but they're moved to do this research and then take these founding era figures and put them in their own voices. And it's been really one of the greatest experiences of my career as an educator, 40 years of teaching, to see that happen. Secondly, completely differently, you're going to immediately see that I am going to present to you a paper in the opposite style of David McCullough, who I've heard speak many times, both publicly and conversationally, and of course has made it clear that the model for lecturing or speaking is that gorgeous, extemporaneous, fluent, irresistible manner. I'm going to read every word of my lecture here, which is derived from two contexts. One is a paper that I was asked to write for a conference, an academic conference at Mount Vernon about women in the world of George Washington. I think I surprised the people of Mount Vernon a little bit because the woman I brought to bear, as you've seen from my title, was Phyllis Wheatley, who nobody at Mount Vernon really thought was immediately part of Washington's world, but I hope to make the case that she was very significantly present, not just at a moment, but in his mind over the long term. The second thing to say is that this is an aspect of work I've been doing in the 18th century, recovering black writers. Phyllis Wheatley hardly needs to be recovered, although I'm going to make a new argument about her importance historically today. But I've been working on a book more broadly for Library of America that I hope will come out in a year, which is called Black Writers of the Founding Era. And we know about Wheatley and some like Benjamin Banneker and maybe Lemuel Haynes and Jupiter Hammond. But I have found more than 100 writers, in the sense of people who produced even letters or petitions to a state legislature or sermons or other important archival artifacts. And I'm very much in the McCullough school of rejoicing in finding things in archives that people have not seen. But this will be the first collection of black writings from the founding era that the Library of America has ever done. And more than 85% of these, I think, have never really been in any modern edition. So I'll try to make sure you have word about that. So let me talk to you. I hope all of you have a copy of a handout. We're going to do some, there'll be more poetry read today probably than you've done in any of your classes in a while, but I hope some of it's useful to you in the long term. The paper I'm going to give you is called Reimagining the Founding Era, George Washington, Phyllis Wheatley, and American Patriotism. In mid-December 1775, just 5 months after he arrived in Cambridge to take command of the American forces, General George Washington received one of the most surprising letters he would ever receive, certainly in the course of the war, perhaps of his lifetime. The letter arrived from Providence, Rhode Island, dated October 26th. Had he opened it himself, he probably would not have recognized the letter writer's name. But fortunately, standard procedures meant that aides in his headquarters fielded all his mail and dispatches and screened them for the proper presentation to the commander-in-chief. This meant that several senior New England officers, all likely to be familiar with the story of Phyllis Wheatley, would have been able to brief Washington on Phyllis Wheatley's background and celebrity as they presented her letter to the general during a lull in the action in mid-December of 75. That background briefing would have been necessary for Washington to appreciate the extraordinary life and achievement of his correspondent and the significance of her letter to him, because he almost certainly had never met anyone like her before. Phyllis Wheatley embodied one of the most heroic life stories of the 18th century. Captured as a child in Africa and carried via the Middle Passage to New England, Phyllis arrived in Boston in July 1761 as a 7 or 8 year old girl, parentless, speaking no English, naked and terrified, being offered for sale on the Boston docks. Something of the horrors of her experience on that slave ship are indicated by the fact that, and we can know this from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database that records the ship, that of 96 slaves taken on board in Africa on her ship, 21 died en route to Boston. Some 25% of Phyllis's fellow captives died at sea while she was on that ship, more even than the usual mortality on slave trading voyages of about 10 to 15%. If such a thing can be said about the life of any slave, Phyllis was relatively lucky. She was purchased by John Wheatley, a merchant, and his wife Susanna, a well-off couple in their 50s, who took Phyllis into their home, intending her to be educated and brought up as a household servant for them and their 2 18-year-old children, Nathaniel and Mary. For the elder Wheatleys, Phyllis was also at another level a kind of surrogate replacement for their daughter, Sarah, who had died at the age of 7 just a few years earlier. Certainly, they treated Phyllis with kindness, and she grew up to feel an emotional closeness, especially to the motherly Susanna, that would surface with a parent-child intensity at key points in her life. To everyone's surprise, Phyllis also proved to be a prodigy. She quickly learned English, becoming fluent in less than 16 months. The Wheatleys schooled her at home, and she pursued her studies eagerly in reading, writing, religion, history, classics, and other subjects. By age 11, she was writing poems, the earliest of which, a short elegy on the death of a family friend, survived because it so impressed the clergyman Jeremy Belknap that he recorded it in his diary twice. By age 14, she was publishing occasional poems in local newspapers, and countless others of her writings were circulating in manuscript, as was the practice of the time. By early 1772, when she was still only 19, she had produced so much poetry that her local supporters and patrons were working with her to publish it as a collection in book form. Initially, the idea was to publish her book of poems in Boston, but nothing came of it because a much greater prospect emerged. Wheatley had achieved transatlantic fame in 1770 for her celebrated elegiac poem on the death of George Whitefield, the renowned evangelist who had led revivals on both sides of the Atlantic for more than 30 years. On the strength of it, Wheatley had begun a correspondence with Whitefield's patroness and follower, the Countess of Huntingdon, a wealthy evangelical and sometime patron of black writers in England. With the help of the Countess and others in her circle, and a group of prominent supporters in Boston, the manuscript of Wheatley's book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was sent off to London in November of 1772, and 10 months later was published to rave reviews. In September 73, the Critical Review of London called her, quote, a literary phenomenon, and the London Magazine gushed that, quote, we cannot suppress our admiration. Glowing reviews of her book appeared in 10 different London periodicals, and in just the 2-year period, 1772 to 3, Wheatley was mentioned in almost 100 different articles across the colonial and British press. Few colonial writers, and certainly no colonial poet, white or black, had ever achieved such acclaim in London, which was, of course, the cultural as well as the political capital of the English-speaking world. A trip to England was arranged for Phyllis that summer while her manuscript was in the press, and in May 1773 she departed for London with much fanfare. She was accompanied by Nathaniel Wheatley, her owner's son, who at age 30 was now fully in charge of the family business. In London, Wheatley was treated as a celebrity, hosted by many prominent people, including the abolitionist Granville Sharp and the agent for Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin. She was given a tour of all the sights, from Westminster Abbey and Parliament to the Tower of London, and mentioned in all the newspapers. She stayed in London enjoying this heady experience for 6 weeks before sailing back to Boston, where she arrived in mid-September at about the same moment that her book was actually being published and reviewed back in London. But the most important outcome of Wheatley's celebrity visit to England was that it enabled her to achieve her own emancipation from slavery. The Somerset decision of 1772 in the London courts had established that no slave, once landed in England, could be compelled to leave, thus granting de facto freedom to any slave who could manage to get there. The decision was widely reported in the press throughout the Anglo-American world, including all the colonial newspapers. Wheatley and her family were well aware of it, and her biographers have concluded that on the basis of the Somerset precedent, which meant that Wheatley would essentially be free once she arrived in England, and no one could compel her to return, she extracted from her master a written promise of manumission, a copy of which she also deposited with a London friend as a safeguard or backup. In this extraordinary way, Wheatley used her literary achievements and fame to negotiate her own freedom, one of the most unusual instances of self-emancipation in all of American history. It also means that when she got on that ship and sailed back to Boston in the late summer of 1773, she not only arrived a free woman, she effectively became the first person of African descent to immigrate to America of her own volition. Meanwhile, it was her writing that was the core of her achievement and self-liberation, and we should attend to it. From the beginning, Wheatley's poetry was remarkable for the ways it went beyond what was seen in the 18th century as appropriate for women writers, who usually restricted themselves to sentimental styles and domestic subject matter. Her poems take on subjects of public importance: religion, politics, military events, government officials, and their policies. And with incredible audacity, coming from a teenage black girl in the 18th century, she had a habit of addressing her poems to prominent male public figures. Listen to some of the people she addressed in her poems, beginning in 1767 when she was only 14 years old. She addressed poems at different times to the University of Cambridge, that is, the faculty and students of Harvard University, another to a clergyman, then one to the deist, then to the Reverend Thomas Amory, then to Captain H of the 65th British Regiment, to a gentleman of the Navy, to the Honorable Commodore Hood, to His Honor the Lieutenant Governor, to the Earl of Dartmouth, and topping them all, to the King's Most Excellent Majesty on his repealing the American Stamp Act. That was 1768. What we should also notice is that from early on, Wheatley's politics were emerging as staunchly pro-American. She could be diplomatic and politically savvy, and when she praises King George in 1768 for repealing the Stamp Act. What monarch would not succumb to the positive reinforcement of lines like these? This is on your handout. She writes, "May George, beloved of all the nations round, live and by earth's and heaven's blessings crowned, may heaven protect and guard him from on high, and at his presence every evil fly. Thus every clime with equal gladness see, when kings do smile, it sets their subjects free." Wheatley, who was still officially a slave in 1768, may well have intended a second, more subliminal message in these lines, because of course King George could also display his benevolence by deciding one day to set other subjects free, i.e. his enslaved black subjects, by proclaiming an end to slavery. For all her discretion and diplomacy in that poem, there are darker themes in the other important political poem she wrote in 1768, the 42-line allegorical depiction of Britannia, the powerful mother figure in conflict with her newly grown-up son, Americus, a poem that Wheatley simply entitled America. That too is on your handout. I won't read the whole poem, but certain passages are telling. In lines 5 to 6, Wheatley deftly presents another double entendre about tyranny and freedom, while also clearly presenting herself as an African American. The lines are these: "Thy power, O liberty, makes strong the weak, and wondrous instinct Ethiopians speak." Here the prospect of liberty makes not only colonies, but enslaved black people assert their strength, speak out, and seek their freedom. In this little allegory, Wheatley labels the son Americus a rebel. In line 23, she says, "What ails the rebel, great Britannia cried," who further on in the poem, quote, "weeps afresh to feel this iron chain of tyranny." The poem closes with an explicit call for Britain to wake up and treat its unhappy son more kindly. Quote, "Turn, O Britannia, claim thy child again." Otherwise, the poet delicately hints, if Britain does not encourage the industry and prosperity of its American colonies, they may be threatened by, quote, "distant continents with vulturing eyes, perhaps taken over or lured away by other imperial powers, or worse, become so aggrieved and unhappy as to rebel on their own behalf and claim their independence." It is against this background of Phyllis Wheatley as a prominent, explicitly political, increasingly pro-American poet who is confident and assertive enough already by her late teens to address major public figures in print, that we can better understand her return to America to claim her new life as a free woman in 1773, and her immersion in the events that quickly led up to her producing the poem Washington first held in his hands in December 1775. Boston Harbor was still blockaded and British troops still occupied the city when Wheatley arrived back from England in September 73. Tensions continued to mount over the next 18 months, as everyone here well knows. The Continental Congress meeting and issuing demands in the fall of 74, the various petitions and proclamations, and tarrings and featherings and clashes in the streets and musterings of militias, until war broke out at Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 75. Within a few days, Wheatley had joined the massive exodus of people from Boston taking refuge in Providence, Rhode Island, along with the rest of the Wheatley family. And as a side note, between 1770 and 1776, the civilian population of Boston dropped from about 15,000 to about 3,000. She and her fellow Patriot sympathizers followed developments from afar, living in Providence, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the ongoing siege of Boston, and then the arrival of George Washington as commander-in-chief. When the news of Washington's arrival to take command reached Phyllis, she was moved to write the poem that is before us today. She had finished the poem by October 26, and that day she wrote Washington a self-effacing and flowery letter to accompany it, and she sent it off by post. It's on your handout, but it reads this way: Sir, I have taken the freedom to address your excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance, though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies. Your being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues, excites sensations not easy to suppress. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Wishing your excellency all possible success in the great cause you are so generously engaged in, I am your excellency's most obedient, humble servant, Phyllis Wheatley. Here it is worth noting two of the political implications of this letter and the accompanying poem. Phyllis had become a free woman when she was manumitted in 1773, but at this moment in 1775, she was declaring herself also irrevocably an American and a patriot. Her bold declaration of support for General Washington as the commander-in-chief of an army in open rebellion against the British government made her complicitous in that rebellion, an outlaw and an enemy. Even as a woman, her writings put her in danger, whether from capture and prosecution by the British or from reprisals against her by loyalists. There was bravery here. We have to remember the uncertainty of the time. Who knew how the war would turn out? Who would be the victors? What they would do to the losers? Or as the war went on, at what stage, in what place, at whose hand those dangers and reprisals might befall her. The other political implication, which Wheatley may not have intended to invoke, but Washington and his aides would quickly recognize, had to do with race. Racial politics, as we'll see in more detail in a moment, played a major role in the American Revolution almost from the beginning. Slaves, for understandable reasons, tended to see the British as potential liberators, or at least as a means to escape their American owners, especially as British commanders throughout the colonies invited slaves to escape to their lines and take up arms against their former masters. And at war's end, the British famously took with them as they left New York Harbor some 3,000 escaped slaves, while many thousands of others had managed to escape in other ways during the 8 years of war. On the other hand, free blacks like Wheatley, especially in the northern states, were more likely to side with the American cause, not only out of loyalty to their fellow citizens, but because they saw new ideas about freedom circulating and the prospect of better opportunities opening up in the new democratic country that was struggling to achieve its independence. To name just two examples, black people had begun bringing petitions for freedom and the protection of civil rights to Massachusetts courts as early as 1773. And the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, building on the activism of Anthony Benezet and others in the 1750s and 60s, was founded in 1775. For free black people, these were hopeful signs. Some of the political implications might have begun dawning on Washington from the first moment he started reading through her poem and decoding its ornate, highly stylized language. Here I want to take the time to actually read the poem line by line to share in what Washington was trying to comprehend. As we take this on, I want you to think of it as something of an historic occasion in its own right. With sort of 50 people in the room, this will probably be one of the largest public readings of Wheatley's poem to Washington since the 18th century, maybe ever. The poem begins this way: To His Excellency General Washington, celestial choir, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. I should pause and make a note here that Wheatley was an early and frequent user of the Latin nickname for America, Columbia, which ironically had first been coined in 1738 by the English writer Samuel Johnson, who would in 1775 denounce the American Revolution for the hypocrisy of white colonists clamoring for freedom while holding slaves. Famously, he said, "How is it we hear the loudest yelps for liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" But Wheatley's poem continues. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light involved in sorrows and the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse, bow propitious while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates. As when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms. Astonished ocean feels the wild uproar. The refulgent surges beat the sounding shore. Were thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. I should pause to point out that Wheatley here uses a Homeric image, soldiers as numerous as autumn leaves, apparently to encourage Washington to believe that troops are flocking to his army to fight the British, a kind of morale boost and a recruitment pitch all in one. In bright array, she goes on, they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou know'st them in the fields of fight. Thee first in place and honors, we demand the grace and glory of thy martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. 1 century scarce performed its destined round when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. She's referring to the French and Indian War. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Now here, Wheatley proves with her phrase, the eyes of nations, that Lynn Miranda in Hamilton was not the first to claim that history has its eyes on you. She goes on, anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, she refers back to Washington, with virtue on thy side, thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. Reading this, Washington would have been gratified by the personal praise and the political support. But of course, he had more urgent matters at hand every day. The siege of Boston, the lack of gunpowder and provisions, troubles manning his army, the constant challenge of outwitting the British. And he made no immediate response, though he may have commented orally to some of his staff. But by early 1776, just a few weeks later, there were new developments that caused him to stop and think again about her poem and return to it. One was the issue of black troops in his army. Black men had fought at Lexington and Concord and at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and were present in the various militias encamped on the Cambridge Common when Washington took command in July 75. But as Washington knew, there were sensitivities in Congress about enlisting black soldiers, especially among the southern states. Washington's own prejudices as a Virginian and a lifelong slave owner also made him uneasy about arming blacks and enlisting them. In October of 1775, in a war council, Washington and his generals voted unanimously, quote, to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether. But still at the same time, there were officers like General John Thomas of Massachusetts who told John Adams, quote, we have some Negroes, but I look upon them in general as equally serviceable with other men. Many of them have proved themselves brave. By the end of November, however, word reached Washington's headquarters of a proclamation by Lord Dunmore, Royal Governor of Virginia, who in desperation to turn the tide of rebellion had on November 7th of 1775 offered freedom to any slave of an American owner who would come over and fight on the British side. Historians estimate that within a few weeks, somewhere between 800 and 2,000 slaves did just that. Dunmore formed them into an Ethiopian regiment, he called it, and from November 75 into the summer of 1776, they engaged in a number of battles and skirmishes. Ripples of panic spread across Virginia, including Mount Vernon, as rumors of escaping slaves and insurrectionist violence circulated everywhere. Washington was gravely concerned, writing to Henry Lee that if Dunmore and his regiments were not, quote, crushed by spring, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. Faced with this threat in the South, and with the precedent of loyal service by black troops in the North, Washington began to change his mind. In the last week of December 1775, he wrote to John Hancock, then presiding over Congress in Philadelphia, to report that, quote, it has been represented to me that the free Negroes who have served in this army are very much dissatisfied at being discarded. As it is to be apprehended that they may seek employ in the ministerial, that is, British army, I have presumed to depart from the resolution that Congress had sent respecting them and have given license for their being enlisted. In the midst of these mounting pressures, Washington's ideas about black people were changing, the start of an evolution in his thinking that would continue to the end of his life. These events help explain why in early February, Washington thought again of the letter and poem from Phyllis Wheatley, but not just out of personal gratitude or guilt over failing to write a thank you. Notably, days before he wrote to Wheatley, he sent a copy of the poem along with a letter to his trusted aide, Joseph Reed, who was now stationed in Philadelphia. On February 10th, 1776, in his letter to Reed, he told him, with perhaps a bit of feigned casualness, that Reed might, quote, be amused by reading a letter and poem addressed to me by Miss Phyllis Wheatley. In searching over a parcel of papers the other day in order to destroy such as were useless, I brought it to light again. At first, with a view of doing justice to her poetical genius, I had a great mind to publish the poem, but not knowing whether it might not be considered as a mark of my own vanity than a compliment to her, I laid it aside till I came across it again in the manner just mentioned. A little over-labored as an explanation, but we'll let that slide. He got the poem to read. It is worth noting that even in the privacy of this personal letter, Washington treats Wheatley with respect and appreciation. Equally noteworthy, nowhere in his letter does Washington allude to her race or her status as a formerly enslaved person, though clearly he and Reed were both fully aware. In any case, Washington had chosen his intermediary deliberately. A skillful political operator, Reed was an opponent of slavery, and a few years later, with the war still underway, would support a 1780 Gradual Emancipation Act in Pennsylvania. Reed took the hint. He immediately saw the same political use that Washington discerned and arranged to publish Wheatley's poem not in any of the anti-slavery newspapers in the North, but in the Virginia Gazette, where it appeared on the front page of the March 20th, 1776 issue. It would not appear in a Pennsylvania magazine, which you would expect, until several weeks later, and that's a place we would expect people who are friendly to black writers and to abolition to be. But it takes a moment for the logic of Reed's and Washington's brilliant move to sink in. In a period of racial tension and white fear in Virginia, which Jefferson would carry to Philadelphia that summer and inscribe in the first draft of the Declaration. You'll remember there's a long paragraph about insurrection happening that got deleted in the final version. Washington and Reed wanted Virginians and all Americans to see a prominent, influential African American who was an outspoken supporter of the American cause. Probably they hoped that everyone might calm down. Whites might form new ideas about the capacities and loyalties of black people and the possibility of including them in the body politic, while blacks might be moved to see possibilities for themselves as supporters of the American cause. In the letter he wrote to Wheatley on February 26th, which is also on your handout, Washington spoke in ways that he probably had never before used in conversation with a black woman. He begins with fashionable banter of the kind one might use in a social setting. Explaining her letter had not reached his hands until mid-December, he wittily anticipates her response, almost as if they were social acquaintances. Quote, "Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this." His opening paragraph is one long apology for not having written sooner. Did ever Washington write such a letter in such a style to a former slave? He goes on to praise her in fulsome terms for her great poetical talents and expresses his view that her poem deserved to be published, and he would have done so were it not for the possible imputation of vanity. An imputation that he further avoids by concealing the fact that he has just arranged to have it published by Joseph Reed. Finally, and most astonishingly, he invites her as an apparent social equal to come visit him at his headquarters in Cambridge. No proof has yet emerged that she did go meet him in person, though historians have conjectured that if such a meeting took place, it would have been between late March 1776, after the British had evacuated Boston and Patriot exiles began trickling back into town, and early April, when Phyllis might still have been in Providence, and Washington and his troops stayed there 2 nights en route to their ill-fated deployment in New York. What a treat for the imagination to picture such a meeting between the two of them. But whether or not it happened, the whole interaction with Wheatley marked a dramatic turning point in Washington's life. In the words of Ron Chernow, quote, "Few incidents in the early days of the war suggest how powerfully revolutionary ideals were transforming George Washington as his reaction to Phyllis Wheatley." Over the course of the war, beginning with those black soldiers the general had under his command in Massachusetts, and the immediacy with which slavery and race became strategic and political issues, immediately, Washington witnessed events and was exposed to ideas that were to bend the arc of his thinking to a moral and political disgust, eventually an expressed opposition to slavery. A man of color had died in the Boston Massacre, it's well known here, Crispus Attucks, and black men had fought at those battles in Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. In 1775, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut all had mixed race regiments, and later there were some all-black regiments. Before the war ended, scholars now estimate as many as 7,000 to 8,000, some are now even speculating as many as 10,000 African Americans had served in the American forces. The first man to die at Valley Forge in December 1775, poignantly on Christmas Day, was a black man from a Connecticut regiment. Among Washington's most trusted wartime aides were idealistic young men who opposed slavery vehemently. John Lawrence, who would propose a black regiment of former slaves from South Carolina in 1779. Alexander Hamilton, who would support the enlistment of black troops during the war, and afterwards co-found the New York Manumission Society with John Jay in 1785. And the Marquis de Lafayette, who would urge Washington to start with him an experimental plantation in 1783 that would educate, train, and manumit slaves and pay them for their labor. Washington, by the way, in response, quietly encouraged that project, but he kept his distance. Lafayette pursued the experiment on his own in Cayenne, French Guiana, in 1785. But it all ended in 1792 when his property was confiscated by the revolutionary French government and the free black workers on his plantation were sold back into slavery. The years of the Revolutionary War were to bring dramatic developments in Wheatley's life too. But unlike Washington, who rose from a very precarious early situation and overcame repeated setbacks to become by war's end the greatest hero of his age, Wheatley's fate moved the opposite way. She began the war as a transatlantic celebrity and a hugely promising literary talent at the top of her game. who by the early 1780s was struggling financially, coping with a difficult marriage, fighting chronic lung disease, and failing despite multiple efforts to get a second book of poetry published, even in her own hometown. She died in December of 1784, still very young, aged 31, and she suffered the additional posthumous injury that the full manuscript of her unpublished second book, which many people had seen and admired, disappeared, and it has never since turned up. Her lost book of poetry would be one of the all-time literary treasures in American history, should it ever reappear. I hope some of your students one day can find it. During the years of the war, Wheatley continued to write poems on a wide variety of topics and occasionally published one in a newspaper or pamphlet. More importantly, she continued to write poems explicitly in support of the war effort. In December 76, she heard about the capture of General Charles Lee and composed a poem in his honor, which is in your handout. Remarkably, given Lee's rivalry with Washington, which clearly was unknown to Wheatley, in the closing line she puts in Lee's mouth these words of defiance to the British and praise for Washington. Quote, "Yet those brave troops, innumerous as the sands, one soul inspires, one general chief commands. Find in your train of boasted heroes one to match the praise of godlike Washington, thrice happy chief, in whom the virtues join, and heaven-taught prudence speaks the man divine." She sent that poem off to James Bowdoin, president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and a prominent leader in revolutionary America. But Bowdoin, who was aware of Charles Lee's erratic behavior and his efforts to undermine Washington, held it back from publication, and it was eventually found decades after Bowdoin's death among his papers still unpublished. Bowdoin probably saved Wheatley from an embarrassing political mistake. 2 years later, her elegy on the death of General Worcester in 1778 rightly celebrated an American war hero who died in battle, while it also served as a personal token of condolence to his widow Mary Worcester, whom Phyllis knew as a friend and supporter. Mary and her late husband, General Worcester, were also opponents of slavery, which Wheatley brought out in the poem by having the spirit of Worcester speak from beyond the grave to criticize America for maintaining slavery while fighting for freedom. These are some of her lines. This is in the voice of the spirit of Worcester. But how presumptuous shall we hope to find divine acceptance with the Almighty mind, while yet, O deed ungenerous, they disgrace and hold in bondage Afric's blameless race. Let virtue reign, and thou accord our prayers, be victory ours, and generous freedom theirs. Wheatley's struggles after she married in 1778 resulted in less writing, and the disappearance of her unpublished book manuscript after she died has left us a very patchy sense of her last few years. But two of the very last poems she wrote were also devoted to the American cause and its heroes. In January 1784, Wheatley published an elegy sacred to the memory of Dr. Samuel Cooper, a very prominent clergyman and American patriot. In his Brattle Street Church in Cambridge, Mass., Cooper had preached and ministered at various times to John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, John Adams, and many other American patriots. In 1783, Cooper was one of the inner circle to whom Washington entrusted the editing of the final draft of the Treaty of Paris. Even more dramatically patriotic is the poem that appears to be the last one Wheatley ever wrote. Entitled Liberty and Peace and published as a broadside in mid-1784, it is a soaring, hopeful, visionary poem about America after independence and its place in the world. It's not on your handout, but it's worth quoting. It's actually available in Coretta's edition of the works of Wheatley. In the closing lines, Wheatley offers an idealistic prophecy for America and the light the new nation will shine on the world of the future. Auspicious heaven shall fill with favoring gales, where'er Columbia spreads her swelling sails. To every realm shall peace her charms display, and heavenly freedom spread her golden ray. As she began, so she ended, an ardent American patriot. Wheatley died later that year, on December 6, 1784. Her past achievements pretty widely known, but her enormous potential cruelly foreshortened. The great scholar of African American history and culture, Professor Henry Louis Gates, who I'm proud to say is also a trustee of the Gilder Lehrman Institute, has called Wheatley, quote, the mother of African American literature. To that well-deserved title, I would like to add another. As the rare American poet, almost unique in her time, who had achieved fame in England and could have pursued her career there with more wealth and fame than in the colonies, who nevertheless gave all that up to return to America, where she risked everything to continue writing some of the most powerful and inspiring poetry of the Revolutionary War period, Phyllis Wheatley deserves also to be called the Poet Laureate of the American Revolution. We do not know if Washington ever read anything else by Wheatley, though she was acclaimed enough in the English-speaking world and her work familiar enough to many of his colleagues and contemporaries that some such moment may have occurred. A copy of one of her poems sent to him or read to him by a visitor or mentioned in a lost letter or conversation over dinner at some point. We do know that by the mid-1780s, Washington was expressing anti-slavery views in his letters to contemporaries, such as the one on April 12, 1786, to Robert Morris, the Philadelphia businessman. Although Washington is writing in this letter in connection with a friend's escaped slave to protest the illegality of someone stealing him, he is embarrassed enough by the topic to tell Morris, and I think this is on your handout, I hope it will not be conceived from these observations that it is my wish to hold the unhappy people who are the subject of this letter in slavery. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of it. But there is only one proper and effectual mode by which it can be accomplished, and that is by legislative authority. And this, as far as my suffrage will go, shall never be wanting. More remarkably, Washington was also expressed anti-slavery views to slaveholders, such as his fellow Virginian John Francis Mercer, whom he wrote in September 1786 that it is, quote, among my first wishes to see some plan adopted by the legislature by which slavery in this country may be abolished by slow, sure, and imperceptible degrees. That letter, by the way, is in the Gilder Lehrman collection in New York, and I hope you'll come see it. Any of you would be very welcome to visit our collection at the New York Historical Society. Other markers of Washington's evolving attitude dot his later years. As president in 1789, Washington signed off on legislation confirming the terms governing the Northwest Territories, which included a permanent ban on slavery, as you know from David's book and talk. We know from Washington's library that over the course of the 1780s and 90s, he acquired a variety of publications written by abolitionists, both British and American, calling explicitly for an end to slavery. Notably, Washington retained these abolitionist pamphlets and at one point took the trouble to pull them together, pull a whole collection of them together, send them off to his bookbinder, whom he then paid to bind them in leather with a label on the spine. And that volume survives by accidents in the Athenaeum here in Boston, where you can actually see the volume that Washington, in effect, compiled and had bound and saved in his library. In the quarter century between Wheatley's poem to Washington in 1775 and Washington's death in 1799, many Americans came to share their belief that slavery was on its way to extinction. One state after another abolished slavery or passed gradual emancipation acts, beginning with Vermont in 1777, Pennsylvania in 1780, Massachusetts through court decisions in 1781 to 3, Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, and New York in 1799, as with New Jersey in 1804. Meanwhile, as we noted, the Congress had banned slavery in the Northwest Territories in 1787, from which 5 free states would eventually emerge in the 19th century. And the first National Conference of Regional Abolition Societies met in 1794 in the capital in Philadelphia. And it would continue to meet in a conference annually until 1806. It is in this context that we should turn to Washington's final expression of anti-slavery thinking, which occurs in his last will and testament. The key sections are reprinted on your handout, and I encourage you to read them closely. For Washington, who knew his will would be widely published after his death and closely read by thousands, eventually millions of Americans, this was a final message to the American people, almost as important as his farewell address 3 years earlier. Unlike that famous speech, which has become canonical and reached a transcendent level of importance to all generations through its magnificent rendering in Hamilton, the musical, the text of his will has slipped from our collective memory. But we can see in it Washington's hope that other Americans would follow his lead and free their slaves, pay to educate and train them to be self-sufficient, and support with decency and care the young, the elderly, and those too ill to care for themselves. In its details, we can see a final intersection with the story of Phyllis Wheatley. It is in his emphasis on education and his implied view of the capacities of black people. It's a key section that's on the handout. He specifies that in the lead up to being freed, the young among his slaves, quote, be taught to read and write and be brought up to some useful occupation. He goes on to block anyone from evading this stipulation, saying, quote, I do hereby expressly forbid the sale or transportation out of the Commonwealth of Virginia of any slave I may die possessed of under any pretense whatsoever. Through the lawyer language, we can see the depth of his feeling on this topic, even stressing that this is the single most important section of his will. Quote, I do, moreover, most pointedly and most solemnly enjoin it upon my executors hereafter named, or the survivors of them, to see that this, and it's italicized with his emphasis in the will, that this clause respecting slaves and every part thereof be religiously fulfilled at the epoch at which it is directed to take place, without evasion, neglect, or delay. As Washington here signaled his belief in the capacity of black people to be educated and to become free, self-sufficient, productive members of society, could he have been drawing on his memory of any example more powerful or more impactful on the country they both helped to found than Phyllis Wheatley? Thank you.